us for our weekly Saving Life on Earth speaker series webinars. Tonight, we're going to talk about sea turtles, and I'm very excited about that. Lots of people love sea turtles. They're totally amazing. Every time I've ever seen one, it's just felt like a little magical miracle. So I'm excited to learn more about them tonight. And while I have your attention about sea turtles, next week, we're going to talk about endangered plants. And so I'm thinking that maybe not that many people are going to sign up for plants, so prove me wrong and show up for next week's webinar about plants. A couple technical notes: we've disabled chat because we heard from you guys that it's distracting. After the webinar, you'll get an email that will have a link to the video, which will be posted tomorrow morning at savelifeonearth.org, and you'll get a link to an action alert that you can take to help sea turtles. We're going to save time at the end for questions and answers. If we don't get to your question, you can join us tomorrow on Slack in the Endangered Species channel at noon Pacific for an hour. And Catherine, who you'll meet in a minute, will be on there with me to answer your questions. There will be instructions on how to join Slack in the follow-up email, or you can send any of us an email. So with that, I'm going to pass it to our speakers to introduce themselves.
Hi. I'm Catherine Kilduff, and I'm a senior attorney in the Oceans program, and I'm based in Norfolk, Virginia. This slide is a photo of me in the polar bear suit as Frostpaw at a climate rally, about 5 years ago. But it's an important slide to me because it shows my mom in the background in the pink vest and my daughter in the foreground, and so it really explains why I'm so motivated to do this work, and that's to make sure that we have a climate that supports future generations.
Hey, good afternoon and evening, everybody. My name is Jaclyn Lopez. I'm the Florida Director, the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm also a senior attorney here. And I wanted to share with you the things that I love most in my life, which is my 2 kiddos. And here's how we've been spending our days in the era of COVID, especially. You know, you look for the silver linings, and we're really fortunate to be living in St. Pete, Florida, where we have really great access to beaches and a lot of just urban wildlife all around us. So I really look forward to our conversation tonight about our imperiled sea turtles.
All right, well, let's jump right in. Jackie, tell us about sea turtles. How many kinds are there and where do they live?
We have 7 different kinds of sea turtles. 6 of them are recognized as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and 5 of those use our waters or nest on our beaches. So sea turtles, as you can see here, I've borrowed a page that shows some of the species on Earth that have some of the longest migration patterns, and few of them that have some rather short ones. And you'll see up in the Gulf of Mexico, tucked up there, is a Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, and compare that to the expansive migration that leatherbacks make all the way across the Pacific. We have, in addition to making these sweeping migrations, we have hundreds, almost 100 countries where these sea turtles nest. And when we talk about nesting in the United States, that mostly is concentrated in Florida and portions of the Southeast, including the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. So the first one I want to tell you a little bit more about is the leatherback. And all of these sea turtle species derive their name from characteristics about them. So leatherbacks are the only sea turtle that don't actually have a hard shell or carapace and scales. Instead, they have a leathery skin covering. They're also really unique in that not only are they the largest of the sea turtles, they're also from a different taxonomic family altogether. They actually coexisted at the time of the dinosaurs and have changed very little since then. They make massive migrations between foraging and breeding and nesting up to 10,000 miles. So they're pretty amazing. And in the United States, they are recognized as endangered in the West Pacific. They're doing a little bit better in the Atlantic. They nest in Puerto Rico. We occasionally have some nests in Florida. It's pretty special when they choose Florida to nest. And what else can I say? They're amazing. I mean, they are just like the school buses of sea turtles. They're really pretty wild to see nest. Next, we'll show you a little bit about loggerheads. Again, named because of a special characteristic about them. They have this massive head, and they use those big jaws to chomp down on mollusks and horseshoe crabs and sea urchins. We see a lot of loggerheads here in Florida, but they can be found, you can see here, they have one of the, along with the leatherback and green sea turtle, they can be found in a lot of different parts of the world, actually. Let's see, what else can I tell you that's really special about them? They do have their concentration of nesting in Florida throughout the Southeast, up to about 68,000 to 90,000 nests a year. And in our area in the Southeast, they're recognized as threatened, but out in the Pacific, they are considered endangered. Next, we'll show you green sea turtles. They are the only true herbivores. As juveniles, they might explore outside of that, the veggies, but for the most part, they're herbivorous, and they're named for the green coloration of their fat, which scientists believe they get from the chlorophyll from all the veggies they eat. And so these guys can be found in 80 different countries, and in the United States, they nest in the east coast of Florida, in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, the Virgin Islands, and in Puerto Rico. In our area in the Southeast, again, they're recognized as threatened, which means that the possibility of extinction is foreseeable but not imminent. And out west, they are considered endangered, which means that their extinction threat is more imminent. Hawksbills, oh, they're so beautiful. One of the principal threats for hawksbills had historically been overcollection due to its beautiful shell. It also has that characteristic hawk-like beak or bill. They eat sea sponges. They have a more restricted range than some of the other sea turtles that you've seen here. In the United States, you can find them nesting, although it's not very common in Florida. They do sometimes nest in Florida, but you can also find them in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And finally, Kemp's Ridleys. These guys are tiny relative to some of their other cousin sea turtles. And they will eat all kinds of different stuff. They'll eat plants, animals. They've even been known to scavenge, which is not a common thing that you'll find with sea turtles. The vast majority of their nesting goes to Mexico, is in Mexico. And they do something that's rather unusual for sea turtles. They will go to nest during the day. A lot of other sea turtle species prefer to do that at night, and they will do it in mass. So they do it in these things called arribadas, which means that arrivals in Spanish, and it's when it can be thousands of sea turtles will arrive at the same time and all come up on shore during the day to nest. And incidentally, when sea turtles are on shore to nest and when they are born are really, with few exceptions, the only time sea turtles ever come back on land. For the most part, their entire lives are spent in the water.
That is so cool, all the different species. So why are sea turtles in trouble? Catherine, tell us why they're endangered.
Thanks. Well, of course, one of the main causes of problems for sea turtles is climate change. And this manifests a couple of ways when you're a sea turtle, actually many, many ways. But I'm going to talk about habitat loss. And this is an island that got washed away in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. I'm going to talk a little bit about sea level rise in Florida at the nesting beaches, and then I'm going to talk about warming temperatures generally and how it affects sea turtles. So for habitat loss, here there's a picture of East Island. You can see over a couple of months that practically the whole island washed away in a hurricane. And this is significant because it was one of the primary nesting beaches for green sea turtles. And as you can imagine, in the Pacific Ocean, these atolls are remote, far apart from each other. And so scientists are hoping that in the subsequent years after this atoll washed away, that the sea turtles that were born on those beaches can find a new beach to come back to, because the hatchlings leave the beaches and they might not come back to nest for 20 to 30 years. And when they come back to their beach where they were born to make the nest and it's not there, we're not really sure what the sea turtles are going to do. In Florida, you know, the beaches don't look exactly like they do in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands because there are roads and hotels and areas of the beach that do not move when sea levels rise. Scientists have estimated that between 78 and 81% of the nesting beach habitat will be underwater due to sea level rise in the next 100 years. And so the real thing that we as humans can do to help the sea turtles adjust to that is make sure that where it can, that those beaches move inland as sea levels rise. And it's a great opportunity in places like national seashores. For example, Canaveral National Seashore in Florida, they have mapped where the beaches are going to move under sea level rise scenarios and storm surge scenarios, and they can plan maybe not to put their bathrooms where their bathroom building where the beach is going to be needed for nesting habitat. And because Canaveral National Seashore is one of the primary loggerhead habitats, the small differences in habitat loss has a huge effect because there are so many nests there for loggerheads and green sea turtles. It's really densely populated. So this sea level rise and the storm surges can affect a lot of the animals. And finally, just on this habitat loss slide, warming temperatures affect sea turtles because the baby's gender is not determined until it's an egg in the nest. And so under climate change scenarios, sea turtles will produce more females because their offspring are influenced by the nest temperature. So next slide. The majority of the marine debris in the ocean is fishing gear, which means that sea turtles really aren't safe anywhere. Even in national marine sanctuaries, there's fishing. So this is a picture on the left of a leatherback sea turtle. Its head is sort of the middle left of the picture, right next to a big orange buoy, and you can see its huge flippers to the top right that are entangled in the line from the buoy. And this particular gear is Dungeness crab gear, and Dungeness crab pots lie on the bottom of the ocean and can be hundreds of pounds with a line that goes to the surface to connect to this buoy. This particular sea turtle was lucky because a boater found it and released it alive. But many are not so lucky, and Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary is one of the primary areas for leatherback sea turtles to come and eat jellyfish. And they cross thousands of miles from where they're born in Indonesia to get to California's really super productive waters. And this happens not only in the Pacific, but also in the Atlantic. And Tiara is going to help us by showing this video of a disentanglement in Cape Cod, Massachusetts this summer. So the leatherback is thrashing around, spraying its rescuers with its long flippers. And as Jackie mentioned, these are huge animals, the size of a Volkswagen Bug. And so it's soul crushing to see them entangled and helpless, but it's always nice to see them freed. Plastic pollution is also a big problem for all sea turtles. This particular sea turtle, the leatherback sea turtle, eats jellyfish. And this is one of my favorite sea turtle videos in the Atlantic off Cape Cod of a leatherback, and it reminds me of a video game. The GoPro is fastened to the back of the leatherback. You can see the jellyfish tentacles streaming out of its mouth. And you can understand why in the murky waters off Cape Cod that a plastic bag would look just like the kind of jellyfish that a leatherback sea turtle wants to eat. So plastic pollution can be ingested, it can be wrapped around them, prohibiting the sea turtles from swimming. And it's a huge problem. Next, artificial lights are a problem when the sea turtles nest on the beaches, and then a couple of weeks later, their eggs hatch, and it's called a boil because the sand literally erupts as the hatchlings dig themselves out. And then they are oriented to the moon's reflection on the water. And so that's how they know to get into the water and not on the land towards a road where a car might run over them, or where they might get stuck in somebody's beach chairs. So in order to keep beaches safe for sea turtles, really there should be no light coming from buildings. There's a common misconception that the term turtle glass means it's turtle safe, but in reality, some of the turtle glass only blocks 45% of the interior light. So you can see the hotel on the left, there's still light emanating from the windows, and that's the problem that will attract the hatchlings toward the land instead of towards the water. Much better is on the right. You can see there's a restaurant with all the windows blacked out on the second story of this building. And you can see how bright it is on the inside because the doors to the restaurant are open. Properties should also use window coverings such as full blinds or drapes. And even though that relies on human behavior to remember to close them, that also will block the amount of light visible from the beach. And so this is good for sea turtles, and it's also good for energy conservation. And there are a couple of more threats like offshore oil and gas, oil spills, beach driving. There's often incidents in the summer where someone's driving on the beach and runs over a nesting female. Harmful algal blooms mean that because of nutrients that humans add to the water, toxic algae will bloom and make the sea turtles sick. But sea turtles have great superpowers that scientists are still learning about, like loggerhead sea turtles' ability to use magnetic navigation and their ability to migrate thousands of miles across the entire ocean and then return to their nesting beaches. So hopefully some combination of our efforts at conservation and mitigating these threats, plus their superpowers, will mean that they can survive for future generations.
I hope so. And so I'd like to get into what you guys are doing for sea turtles. That's a lot of threats. Tell us about some of the work the center is doing to save them.
So
Jack, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so happy to kick us off with a major victory we can celebrate. Just last Friday, a federal judge in Florida agreed that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Fish and Wildlife Service had violated the Endangered Species Act by failing to consult on discharges from the lake. It's the second largest lake in the lower 48 states, and it has packed with nutrients and it's packed with harmful algal blooms. And the judge ordered that we were correct in bringing this case and getting relief for these sea turtles, among other species that are affected by these massive discharges that influence harmful algal blooms. So we're optimistic that we can get some good measures in to protect sea turtles, among other species that are affected by harmful algal blooms. A few years ago, we secured some critical habitat. I mean, more than just some, actually. We secured about 685 miles of nesting beaches spanning from Mississippi all the way up to North Carolina. And we have, as well as about 300,000 square miles of protected waters where loggerheads need to grow up. Catherine mentioned that sea turtles, once they leave their beaches, we don't know what happens to them. And it's true, they're the wonder years. We wonder where they've gone to because they don't come back to the shores, and they have pretty high site fidelity. They don't come back to their shores until they're ready to nest again. And so securing that critical habitat for the loggerhead sea turtle was really important for its future survival. We know that species that have designated critical habitat are much more likely to be not just surviving extinction, but actually making recovery gains. So getting to a place where the protections of the Endangered Species Act are no longer necessary. Likewise, a few weeks ago, we secured another legal victory with respect to critical habitat for green sea turtles, and we're expecting a proposed decision for green sea turtles for critical habitat by 2023. We're really excited about that for the same reasons I shared about the loggerhead sea turtles. The victory that I mentioned first about the harmful algal blooms has to do with Lake Okeechobee in Florida. So we can move on now to the next slide that has to do with shrimp trawl fishing. So Catherine mentioned that one of the principal threats for sea turtles has to do with entanglement in fishing gear. And for a lot of the sea turtles that are in the Gulf of Mexico and the South Atlantic, the majority of that comes from getting trapped in these shrimp trawl devices. And these are big nets, well, depends on the side of the boat, but it's pretty relative, that are either in front of, behind, or next to the boats with the intention of trapping shrimp, capturing them. Unfortunately, it captures a lot of unintended other species called bycatch, and among them are sea turtles. Nearly every sea turtle of the 5 sea turtles that I listed get captured in these nets. And that's problematic for sea turtles because they need air to breathe. They can't breathe underwater. They need to surface, and depending on the species and the time of year or the water temperature, they may have up to 55 minutes or maybe even longer, or maybe less than that. And some of these nets, as they move through the water, stay underwater longer than that. And if it has a sea turtle in it, that sea turtle has the possibility of getting injured or even drowning and dying. And so we, the center, along with our allies, like Turtle Island Restoration Network, have been working for, oh gosh, over a decade now, trying to get turtle excluder devices installed in all of these types of different fishing gears. And we were really close. We had secured a legal victory. We had a proposed rule, and under the current administration, that rule was reversed not too long ago. So we're looking into what we can do about that, but I'm very hopeful that it's not much longer before all of these types of devices have a turtle excluder device installed in them, which allows them, once they get trapped into the net, to have a safe way to escape so that they can breathe. And the final one I'll touch on briefly, it has to do with artificial beach lights. And, the sea turtles, well, first of all, nesting mamas don't want to come up onto a beach that's brightly lit and has a lot of activity going on it. They're actually really skittish and want to be putting their nests in a place that's going to be safe so that their babies can hatch. They don't hang out and wait for them. They go off, and they might actually lay a few more nests in that season. So that's a deterrent to begin with. But even after a sea turtle decides that it's safe to leave her babies in a nest on a beach, once she leaves and those eggs incubate and they emerge, most of the time it's at night, they try to orient themselves towards the water by looking for the brightest part of the horizon, which is usually reflected by the water. And so in a natural setting, that's always going to be the water. It's going to reflect the stars and the moon. But in an artificial setting where we have a lot of beach light pollution, these little tiny guys, which, I mean, they're itty bitty. I mean, they can get flipped over just in a footprint. They start walking toward the light. And in some cases, like in Fort Lauderdale, that can mean that they end up on a highway or a parking lot. And the image is pretty gruesome here, but these are actually squished sea turtles that baby hatchlings, just minutes or hours old, that got squashed by cars because they wandered the wrong way. And so along with our partners, Sea Turtle Oversight Protection, which is a great local nonprofit out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, sent a notice of intent to sue to a Hilton hotel that had particularly high rates that have been documented by our partners at Sea Turtle Oversight Protection of disoriented sea turtles in the thousands, and resulting in death and disorientation. And, that's an example of where we've had to try to move forward with litigation, but there are many other examples just in that area where we reached out to folks that had damaging artificial lights and tried to make them aware of the violations of not just their local ordinance, which requires that you can't have beach lighting visible from the beach, or rather artificial light visible from the beach, but also the Endangered Species Act, which says that you can't harm sea turtles in this way. And we have had a lot of success reaching out to these organizations, showing them the ways that they can correct some of these violations. And for the most part, these are relatively simple, inexpensive fixes that can save thousands of sea turtle lives. And every single one of them counts. For every 10,000 sea turtles that are born, only a handful actually reach reproductive maturity to breed again. So it's really important that we're giving these guys who have such a miraculous life ahead of them that is fraught with a lot of different threats and dangers, the best, at least that first few hours, the lowest stress, the best case scenario for reaching the water.
Thanks, Jackie. Catherine, you want to jump in and tell us about your work?
Sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to address fishing off California. I mentioned earlier that California is a really important area for both loggerheads and leatherbacks, but specifically off Central to Northern California, and even all the way up to Washington State, leatherback sea turtles are looking for jellyfish to eat. For a couple of years, 3 to 4 years, adult leatherbacks will stay off the US West Coast just to eat. And so it's really important that we keep those waters free from fishing gear that will get wrapped around their flippers for the few months that they're there. They move offshore in the winter. They go south towards Central America and the equator. But during the summer, they're off California, and so we have petitioned the California Fish and Game Commission to list them as a California endangered species. And the reason this is important is because that means that the state fishing gear, which is often traps or pots for spiny lobster or Dungeness crab or rock crab, those pots will have to get review from the state government to look at their impacts on leatherback sea turtle. And it's also important that they're listed on the California Endangered Species Act in addition to the Federal Endangered Species Act, because of the constant efforts to weaken the Federal Endangered Species Act. And so we had a hearing last month in front of the California Fish and Game Commission, and they voted to accept our petition and start a year-long status review. And so in about a year, we're hoping for a positive listing decision. And the good news is during that status review, leatherback sea turtles are a candidate species, which means they get all the protections as if they were listed. So one of the reasons it's important for this listing is because the National Marine Fisheries Service, the federal government, is still trying to introduce long lines off California. And long lines fish for swordfish. So these are pelagic long lines, meaning they're in the open ocean. And they can stretch for over 60 miles, a 60-mile long main line with branch lines and hooks hanging down from that main line. And so it's industrial fishing gear. It's left to set often overnight, and the sea turtles that have to breathe air often drown in those long lines. And we have been fighting the Hawaii longline industry and their take of leatherback and loggerhead sea turtles for decades. And now the federal government wants to introduce longlines off California. We got a great court decision just in December of last year, 2019, where the judge cited the federal government's own opinions that said every turtle counts. And so even killing one just to test this longline fishery in the sea turtles' feeding grounds is too much and requires a full environmental impact statement under the National Environmental Policy Act. And she also rejected their biological opinion under the Endangered Species Act. So we are going to continue to attend public hearings and get member turnout to try to stop these longline permits from being issued in California. One good news is that the Dungeness crab state fishery has agreed to take measures to avoid leatherback sea turtles. So commercial Dungeness crab is one of California's biggest, most profitable fisheries. There are potentially over 100,000 pots connected to a buoy at the surface, and these vertical lines that connect the pot and the buoy along the California coast. And so the state government, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, has proposed regulations that say that the fishery will close in the spring once a leatherback sea turtle is seen off California, or as long as they are there in the fall, the fishery won't open. And so one of the ways that they know whether the sea turtles are there is because they tag them. And you can see that happening now in this photo. And I recommend that you go to the website if you're interested in seeing more sea turtle videos, because they have some good ones about Pacific leatherbacks. But our lawsuit was under the Endangered Species Act. We alleged that the department, by authorizing the Dungeness crab fishery, was harming, killing leatherback sea turtles without an Endangered Species Act permit. So they have applied for their Endangered Species Act permit. They have proposed these regulations that would allow them to manage their fishery in a way that will not harm leatherback sea turtles. So we're very optimistic that there will be a result that the sea turtles will live with in that case. We're also trying to promote something called ropeless fishing gear, the pop-up buoys. Instead of having that vertical line going from the surface to the heavy traps at the bottom of the ocean, now there's technology just to pop up the buoy remotely and pull up the trap. I also want to talk about our efforts to stop plastic pollution. We had a recent Hawaii water quality win. You can see here that the beaches in Hawaii have a lot of plastic trash. Basically, the North Pacific Gyre is a huge swirly ocean current, and the Hawaiian Islands act as a strainer, and they get all this plastic on their beaches, which is problematic not only for sea turtles, but also for endangered Hawaiian monk seals and lots of other animals. Under the Clean Water Act, states have to designate impaired beaches and impaired waters. And so we commented to Hawaii saying that these beaches are impaired. One of them even has a nickname of Plastic Beach, and Hawaii did not list the beaches as impaired for plastic pollution. And so we finally filed a lawsuit that forced Hawaii to go back and re-examine that decision. And when they again failed to list the notoriously polluted Turn Island and Camilo Beach, the EPA regional administrator unilaterally decided to list them. And that was just a couple of months ago in July. So that was really exciting. And we've also tried using creative lawyering. We petitioned the EPA to study Tern Island as a Superfund site. So EPA accepted our petition and assessed Tern Island to see whether it could be listed on the national priorities list, which is where they list Superfund sites, for plastic pollution. This was the first time that EPA had considered a site, whether to list a site as a Superfund site because of plastic pollution.
So you guys are busy fighting threats to sea turtles on all fronts. Tell us how our members can help save sea turtles.
At the end of today's webinar, you'll receive an email and instructions for taking action. And so this is a type of thing that you can do just by clicking a button and sharing it with a friend. So the action alert that you'll receive has to do with something near and dear to us in the Gulf of Mexico, which is the Padre Island National Seashore in Texas. And that particular area and that facility is doing a great job taking care of our kemps and our green and our loggerhead sea turtles, but is facing a budget cut of 30% by the National Park Service, which would really hamstring its ability to help these species, which help facilitate incubation and hatching and release of young sea turtles, as well as help collect stranding data. So we really need your help with letting the National Park Service know that this should continue to be fully funded so that these services are available for these sea turtles. And that's one easy thing that you can do.
You can also join us when we turn out our members at public hearing. I mentioned when we asked the California Fish and Game Commission to study whether sea turtles, leatherback sea turtles, should be listed under the California Endangered Species Act. We had a hearing, and the commissioners are impressed when people show up and talk about why it's important to them to save sea turtles. There was even a participant from Scotland, and this was in the middle of the night for her because it was in the afternoon in California. And the commissioners seem to be impressed by that. So please come with your stories, your personal anecdotes about when you saw a sea turtle, what it means to you, and why it's important that they're saved. And we will post these on the Mobilize map, and we'll also send emails when there are opportunities to do this.
Another thing that you can do is donate your time and your money to nonprofit organizations that work to protect these species. There are a lot of great, especially little local volunteer-run organizations that patrol beaches. So if you are fortunate enough to live in one of those areas, they're almost always looking for volunteers to help patrol, to identify when there's a new nest, to help monitor the nest and monitor for disorientation. And if you don't have that time available or live near one of those places, then donating your money to help keep these places afloat, like Sea Turtle Oversight Protection, like Friends of Tampa Bay National Wildlife Refuges, Sea Turtle Trackers, the list goes on and on, Anna Maria Turtle Watch. That's just the few that I work with in Florida that every dollar amount, any dollar helps, any hour helps.
And finally, you can make personal choices that will help leatherback sea turtles. You can eat less seafood, particularly less seafood like tuna and swordfish that are caught using long lines or drift gill nets. You can also reduce your plastic usage. You know, talk to your local store, ask them to reduce their packaging, ask your local elected officials if you can have a zero waste policy for your city. And these small actions do add up so that we can stop plastic pollution by stopping plastic production. And plastic comes from oil and gas. So if we reduce our production of plastic, not only will there be less plastic in the ocean, but we won't have to drill for oil, which also threatens sea turtles.
Thank you both for sharing all of that. Let's take some questions that people have been typing in. There's a whole list of them over here. If we don't get to your question in the next 20 minutes, we'll be on Slack tomorrow at noon, or if you have a burning question and you can't be on Slack, you can email us. First question is, why would threatened versus endangered status be different on the east or west coast? Why aren't they considered as one population?
There are differences even within the species that become really specialized to the species based on geography, which is why a few of our sea turtle species have been further recognized by wildlife management agencies as distinct population segments. And that's because of the areas that they use. So they don't necessarily migrate beyond the Atlantic, for example, and they are different because of where they're using the habitat, the territory, and for that reason have a different management regime. And as a result, depending on what the various threats are to them within the US territory, but also compounded with what's going on outside of the US's reach, because these sea turtles are so highly migratory, even when the US is doing a great job, and I would say we're doing a good job, we're not doing a great job. There's a lot of room for improvement. There are other countries that are even doing worse than we are with respect to how they take care of their sea turtles. And so depending on where the other places are that a sea turtle might visit might influence whether or not its extinction risk is more or less foreseeable. It's closer or farther away.
Thanks, Jackie. People are asking if you can rename some of the local organizations that people could donate to.
Sure. I mean, local is relative, right? So I'll give you the ones that are local to me here in St. Pete, Florida. So the first one I mentioned that we partner with in Fort Lauderdale is Sea Turtle Oversight Protection. They're super on the ball. Not only do they have volunteers and train volunteers that go out every single night during nesting season, even when we have hurricanes, but they also document all of the stranding data and all of the disorientation data. And then they take it even a step further. And when there is high levels of disorientations, they go and they file the complaint with the city and with the state. So they just go above and beyond as far as I'm concerned. But some of the other local organizations are Friends of Tampa Bay National Wildlife Refuges. They do a lot of advocacy and education in the area. There's Sea Turtle Trackers, which is right here in St. Pete. They could always use more volunteers as well as funding. And the other one that I'm familiar with in the area is the Anna Maria Turtle Island Watch. And I think the rest of the name might be like Shorebird Alliance.
Thanks, Jackie. Catherine, do you have any suggestions on where people could donate or volunteer?
No, I would just reiterate that the stranding networks, which are listed online, do a lot of work, and it's late at night and early in the morning and hard work. So like she said, all weather, all time, they need people to be watching for these nests to be hatching.
So another question, why is fishing allowed in marine sanctuaries, and is anything being done to make it illegal?
I can take that one. Marine sanctuaries are set up to protect the resources within their boundaries. And there are some marine sanctuaries that are set up, for example, to protect shipwrecks, like the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary, or the most recent one that's been designated in Maryland. The Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary includes protections for the natural living resources there. And so we are hoping that now that we have evidence that the certain types of fishing gear are harming sea turtles and large whales like humpbacks, that they will take action to, for example, require only pop-up or ropeless fishing gear. But it's an ongoing process, and the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary right now has a public comment period open on its draft management plan. So there's always an opportunity to get involved.
What's the reception you get when you ask restaurants or hotels to dim the beachfront lighting? And are there ways that the public can help pressure them to do that, especially during the hatching season?
That's
Is
a
the
great
hatching
question.
season public?
Yeah. So nesting and hatching season in Florida is getting earlier each year. This year we had turtles making their way up onto the beaches in February and March, which is really quite early, but generally it's a little bit later than that, and it goes all the way even into October. So it's about half the year. It depends. A lot of, well, I don't know about a lot, but many of the entities that we approach to let them know that their beach lighting is resulting in sea turtle take are surprised to learn that, and want to be good stewards. I think the majority of people are well-intended, but maybe just don't realize what the harm is. And so that's the initial reception. And we try to provide the resources that like the the experts that can come in free of charge and do a site inspection and explain what different changes might be necessary. So most of them are pretty receptive. There's a few that for whatever reason are just stubborn or unwilling to accept responsibility. And so what regular folks can do is, if you observe, if you have any knowledge about this stuff and you observe particularly bright lights and you know that sea turtles use the area, you can make your voice known as a consumer and explain that that you think that this is taking sea turtles or harming sea turtles or has the ability to do that, and that you would choose not to go here to this business if they don't change their behavior. I mean, I suppose there's a lot of different ways you could be creative about it, but maybe linking up with a local nonprofit that does this type of work already would be an effective strategy also.
Similar question, how can people help dissuade California and other states from having any longline fisheries?
That's a good question. And unfortunately, it seems like a constant effort. We will certainly have more public hearings on this question. Last month, they just had a public hearing on scoping the next environmental impact statement. So we will let you know, but it's also important to support positive efforts like listing sea turtles under the California Endangered Species Act and asking for more protections in marine sanctuaries from dangerous fishing gear. Part of the problem is that under federal law, the law that governs fishing is called the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, and it allows the federal government to be constantly promoting fishing. And so there's this idea in the federal government that we're not utilizing our swordfish resource, which basically means that if people aren't pulling the fish out of the ocean, then it must be going to waste. And so part of this is a systemic problem with the way our federal laws are written, that it seems like we'll be constantly in conflict with species conservation. And part of it is just hopefully with more education, with people valuing wildlife and understanding that we're in an extinction crisis, that people will realize that certain types of fishing, industrial longlines being one of them, is just incompatible with continuing to have leatherback sea turtles in the Pacific Ocean.
Somebody asked about noise pollution. Is noise pollution a threat to sea turtles?
Yeah, it absolutely is. One of the more terrifying prospects recently has been widespread seismic exploration on the East Coast. And Jackie knows this well because Florida is both a Gulf Coast state and an East Coast state. And so there's lots of opportunity for oil and gas exploration. And the seismic air guns are extremely powerful, and they are used to detect oil deposits underneath the ground. And so we're really worried about how that would impact both whales and sea turtles. But there's also a general problem of noise pollution increasing in the ocean with increasing commercial cargo traffic. It's really fun to look at marinetraffic.com because you can see how many boats are in the ocean. It is positively overwhelming. And sea turtles are vulnerable both to ship strikes and they're affected by noise pollution, especially leatherbacks because they're right at the surface of the ocean. They're not very visible. Even some of the measures to slow down ships to protect whales don't help sea turtles that much because they go so slowly. So you would really have to slow down a ship to like 2 knots to let a sea turtle avoid it.
So what you talked earlier about trying to get beaches listed as impaired. What happens when a beach is listed as impaired?
Well, once it's impaired under the Clean Water Act, that restricts the permits for pollution that the state can then give out. It's complicated for plastic pollution because it's not exactly like, oh, well, in some cases, there are factories that make plastic pellets. And so there we know exactly how the plastic is getting into the ocean. But a lot of the land-based plastic, or like the majority of marine debris that's from fishing gear, is not plastic pollution that will be permitted by the government. And so that makes it hard to ratchet it back. But once a water body is designated as impaired, then that gives it, there's more public awareness that it's impaired, and there are regulatory steps that have to be taken to clean up those beaches.
Are turtle excluder devices being used outside the United States?
Yes, and actually they are required by international treaties that the U.S. is a part of. And so, for example, the issue of sea turtles being entangled in shrimp trawls is an issue that Costa Rica has to deal with as well. The difference between the U.S. and Costa Rica is they've taken affirmative steps to phase out all of the nets that don't have excluder devices, so they will be completely sea turtle friendly much sooner than the U.S. has endeavored to be.
Is it practical to ask shrimp fishermen or other fishermen to bring up their nets more often so that sea turtles can breathe?
So that's already a requirement. So for shrimp nets that don't have the turtle excluder devices, for a while the larger nets, well, turtle excluder devices have been a requirement for larger vessels with larger nets for a while, and that's how we know they work. The smaller boats with the smaller nets are the ones that don't currently have the turtle excluder device requirement, and instead they have a tow time restriction, which does mean that they have to bring up their net to inspect it. What we found, though, and what the National Marine Fisheries Service has reported, that even when there are observers, so announced observers on board those vessels, compliance with those tow time restrictions is remarkably low. So the result is that you have a lot of sea turtle entanglement and death because those tow time requirements are not being observed.
Here's another international question. I don't know how relevant this is. Is the center working to help protect the leatherback nesting in Papua New Guinea?
Jackie, do you want to?
Well, I can talk about what we tried about 10 years ago. I don't know if we have something more recent that Catherine can fill us in on. We have tried. So, for example, there was a project that we engaged in about 10 years ago where the Export-Import Bank was financing a liquefied natural gas facility in Papua New Guinea that would impact leatherback sea turtles. And so we brought claims under the Endangered Species Act and National Environmental Policy Act. And that was in litigation for a few years, but we ultimately lost because the judge found that those laws didn't extend extraterritorially into those areas.
And I would say that the U.S. laws, this is not related to international nesting beaches per se, but they do allow the U.S. government to prohibit seafood imports if the seafood is not using standards that are comparable to ours that will safeguard sea turtles. So that's one way that we can keep out seafood imports that harm sea turtles.
Somebody asked about changing jellyfish populations and if there's any studies about jellyfish populations in sea turtle food.
Yeah, I don't know of any specific studies of jellyfish populations in sea turtle food, but there is more general thinking that as climate change progresses, that eventually we'll have more lower on the food chain animals than higher on the food chain animals. So there might be more jellyfish ultimately. But it's interesting because leatherback critical habitat is defined on the West Coast as jellyfish because that's why they come to the West Coast. But one of the ways you protect critical habitat is by consultation for federal activities that adversely affect the critical habitat, meaning the jellyfish. And unfortunately, we really don't know how to count jellyfish. We can't tell how many jellyfish we catch in our fishing nets or our gill nets. And so it's a little bit tricky because jellyfish are so important to sea turtles. And like this question asks, you know, are there studies? How do you count how many jellyfish there are? And we haven't really gotten a grasp of that adequately.
So I have to ask this question. How long do sea turtles live?
So sea turtles are pretty long-lived. They're really slow to reach sexual maturity. A lot of them not even until they're in their 12th or 13th year. And in some species, it's older than that. So they can be around for many, many decades.
Somebody asked if we can increase enforcement of some of the policies you mentioned earlier. It sounds like there's good policies in place, but they're not necessarily enforced so strictly.
Enforcement is always a matter of political will. It's really difficult using the legal system to compel enforcement. That is something that is the responsibility of whoever we have elected to be in charge of whatever agency is supposed to be doing the enforcing.
Well, we are just about out of time, but thank you, Jaclyn and Jackie and Catherine for joining us today. And thank you behind the scenes to Karina and Brittany. Next week, we're going to talk about endangered plants, so don't miss that. You're going to get an email right after this webinar with a link to the action alert that you can take to help sea turtles. And tomorrow we'll post the video and we'll be on Slack at noon to answer any more questions that you might have. So thank you so much for joining us.
Bye, good night.
Thanks, good night.